Welcome to video 3, the case studies. What we're going to be doing in this final video is looking at a number of different images and using them to illustrate the key points that we consider to be essential in understanding advanced Lightroom processing. And we're going to be trying as best we can to take each image through to its final point, even though certain images don't require certain steps and other images require more steps. So bear with us, but we will get there in the end. In this first section, I want to look at what I consider to be the first stepping stone for all images, which is creating the overall feel and mood. Now, we're not going to be carving this in stone because of course we can come back at any time and change it, but it's a good starting off point. And the point I want to make at the very start of this video is whenever we're processing our images, whether it's in Lightroom or Photoshop or any other sort of software, the key point is to let the image speak to you. You let the landscape speak to you when you made the image. Now is the time to listen to the image and take in the visual clues that the image is giving you to process it in a way that's appropriate. And this appropriateness is a key consideration to what we're going to be trying to teach you. So let's start off with something that graphically I consider to be quite a nice image. I think it has some reasonable elements in it. The light was quite overcast, a little bit flat, but at the end of the day, I think it's a good example because it allows us to make some quite dramatic changes to an image that many people might consider to be maybe a little bit ordinary. Now, the first thing I want to do is look at any problems. This coming in from the left-hand side was unavoidable. I had a fixed prime lens. I was unable to compose it. I didn't want to go too much further to the right, so I kind of figured that I was going to remove this at some point in the processing stage. And I think that in its own right is probably a reasonable compromise. It's just to get rid of it, and at the same time I'm just leveling the horizon there. And by removing that left-hand side, we've opened up this channel. It's a completely it's created space on this left-hand side, even though we've actually cropped the image. We've created space by removing an obstacle to the eye. So now the eye is much more capable of flowing around things. And this is really what we're starting to call visual separation. Now, the first thing we're talking about here is creating the overall feel and mood, and we touched on this earlier in one of the previous videos. The two best keys for setting overall feel and mood are the temperature and exposure sliders. Now, the exposure slider really tackles midtones, and if you darken your midtones, then everything else falls into suit. Obviously your highlights come down as well and your shadows do get darkened. So that instantly creates a much darker, moodier and more oppressive image. The blue slider here, if we slide that further into the left hand side, all of a sudden we've gone from an image that felt as if it was taken on a cloudy afternoon to an image that now looks like it was taken well after sunset. If that is the direction that you want to go, then that's fine. We may find that we want to produce an image that looks much more like a sunset image, in which case we can warm up the overall feel of the image and use our camera calibration tools as we did before. And even though I've gone for a dark start here, I mean, I've reduced it by 1.3 stops, don't let that fool you into thinking that that is going to be the overall final darkness of the image. We now have the opportunity later to add light, especially to these highlighted areas. You can see there's a slight sheen on the rocks there where they were wet and they are catching the light. And then we have leading edges here and here and here and even into these sides here. We will come back to this image later on to actually shape this landscape to create much more depth and to create that feeling that there was much more light coming in here from the left hand side. But for now, with this image, the overall mood is going to be this one. If we go and select another image, this one is another classic example. The contrast in this image is quite high. We have very deep shadows and very bright highlights, so we have a lot of dynamic range. And if we look at the histogram, you can see we have, from the darkest blacks to the brightest whites, we have pixels represented here. Now, anything we do to the mood of this image is going to be in terms of color. Now, at the moment, it's a very rich sunset image. We can cool that down or use the picker here to try and find a more neutral white balance. And you could actually go quite a long way into cooling this image and still retaining the warm, rich sunset tones. If we compare that from where we started, it is a significantly cooler image. Now, this may work for us as a better starting point, because with the first version, the original version, most of it is very warm, and we would have to cool some of these other areas to create that visual contrast. Whereas with this version, most of it or more of it is cooler to start with, and we can actually get to a stage where we're just creating a nice visual balance by a little bit of local color dodging and burning. So again, in terms of the exposure in this image, if you open up the if you open up the shadows so you get a much more open image, we're going to have problems controlling the highlights. There's only so much dynamic range an image can represent at any one time, and if we open up the shadows by using the exposure slider, then we have to really understand how we're going to manage these highlights later on. It can be done, so let's leave it like this for now. We'll start with a brighter image and work to dark, although my own personal preference is to start with dark and work to light. That seems a more logical way for me to do it. So for now, we shall move into one final image, and I want to come back to this one. This is one that we decided we thought we might start faking a warmer light to, and I just want to start with a slightly colder feel, and I'm going to add warmth to where I want it. Most of the image is going to be cool. I think we're going to have some warmth up in this top hand corner here, and maybe a slight highlight on the peak here. So again, setting the overall mood of the image, we do that with the temperature slider and the exposure slider. In the next part of the video, I want to discuss emphasizing visual elements. Cameras don't see the world the way we do. When I was stood in the middle of this river photographing this scene, the boulder in the foreground was so pronounced and so prominent, and was such a key part of this image. And the camera has ignored it in many ways, because it doesn't see shapes, it doesn't see anything that we are seeing, it doesn't see the significance of the things that we're looking at. All it sees is get the light in the can and make it grey. So it's not done a particularly great job of emphasizing this scene as I want to do it. I apologize that it was a slightly underexposed frame. The storm came in during the middle of a long exposure, and I didn't make any adjustments, so it came in at probably a stop and a half, couple of stops dark. Now, what we're going to do with this is, I feel that cooling this scene down further, I really want to bring the blues out in this scene a lot more. I want to create a lot more visual contrast in terms of color and tonality, and you can see the effect that that slider has on that foreground rock. See those oranges pop? It really helps to boost those colors. It's had the effect of making the sky a little magenta, but we can fix that super easy. If you come across situations where something you do globally affects an area very badly, it's like this area here is super blue, this is super blue, just use your saturation targeting tool to pull it down a little bit. So just that tool there, and what's happened is by targeting those tones, we'll just pull the blues down a little. Right. This has got to a stage now where tonally I'm kind of happy with the overall thing. I might just darken it a fraction. And what I want to do in this section is just use our adjustment brush again to really dial in on a couple of things. I want to warm up this section of sky a fraction and add some contrast. I want to darken the shadows in this area and create a little bit of contrast in here, so maybe brighten the snow a fraction. And then I want to open up this rock to make it really pronounced against the overall spectrum of things. Now, something I said earlier is the overall mood and tone of the image can change. At the moment I've gone for this type of tonality. If I want to make it cooler yet, that's something we may well do in the future. Now, the adjustments are really simple. Double click on the effect to zero everything. So this section of sky I want to warm. So the first thing we do is add temperature and tint, and that will add a little of that, maybe a touch of saturation, touch of clarity, and a touch of contrast. And with a nice big brush, we just paint in there. And that has instantly lifted that sky. And if we turn on the effect, turn off the effect and turn it on again, you can see it's made quite a significant difference. We're just gonna spill that over. Big feather, medium flow, and I'm happy with that. If we click on a new pin and make the brush a bit smaller, zero the effect again, and just really pump the contrast, then I'm just going to paint in a bit of contrast underneath that ridge, and then reducing the flow even further. I'm going to feather it out over that section there. And if I use the O key, you can see where that has been painted in. And if I adjust the contrast, you can see that it's made that section just a little bit moodier. And if I want to, at this stage, I can just go to the tone curve and say, I'm just going to target those tones there. Just lift them a fraction and then find something a fraction darker and just give it a little nudge. And that little nudge has just created a little bit more tonal contrast in the whole image in those particular mid-tones. Now finally, I just want to start brushing in this, this rock. So again, we click on the new, and I want to brighten it a fraction. I want to add quite a bit of clarity and saturation and bring up the highlights and reduce the shadows, which is going to increase contrast. And then with a nicely feathered brush, I'm just going to paint in the rock. So if I use the O key again, you'll see where I'm painting. Gently feathered. And if we look at the different parameters, we can play around with the various sliders. You know, you can make it cooler, you can make it a lot warmer. Add a bit more contrast. Make it really saturated. And what's clear here is there's not enough tonal separation between this and the water. So what I'm going to do is come out of the adjustment brush, go back to my overall global tint and cool that image a fraction more. Because I want that rock to really stand out. So I'm going to darken the image a fraction more. I'm going to go back to my adjustment brush and click on that pin which activates that one, turn off the O key so that I can see what I'm doing, and then I'm going to lift that rock in terms of its exposure. I need to increase the flow a section because I think the flow was quite low. And what it's done is it hasn't put much of that effect onto it. There we go. We're starting to make it sing now. And the same thing with the sky. the sky's not quite as warm because what we did was we went into the global side of things and we cooled the overall image, and that's cooled that pin as well. And the other pin needs a fraction of adjustment as well. And there we go, we can see that a little bit better. So now if I turn off and on the 3 adjustment brushes, you can see the profound effect we've had, how we've increased that boulder in the foreground, we've changed the color of that warm part of the sky completely, and we have added some contrast up in that top left hand corner. Now we will be coming back to this image a little bit later to make some more adjustments, but for now that will do in terms of enhancing visual elements with the adjustment brush. We will be looking at other local adjustments shortly, and in particular leading the eye through the frame. So we shall come back to that in a moment, and we will see you shortly. Many landscape photographs already have leading lines in them. If we look at this example here, the water flowing through the frame is a natural leading line, and it is natural for the eye to follow the flow of the water through the frame. Likewise with this one, same location, different composition, but the flow through the frame takes you from the front right through to the mountain in the back. This one also, we have the rock in the foreground and a leading line that comes up and through to the mountain at the back. These are obvious compositional devices that we use when we're composing our images. You look at just about every image that I've chosen here and it has some form of leading line actually incorporated into the composition of the image. Now, these are all well and good, and it's good to have these compositional elements working for us, but these can always be enhanced because the camera doesn't always see the line quite as effectively as we do, and quite often sometimes the image doesn't have such a strong leading line. This one, for example, we have very clear mountains in the back, which can very much be perceived as the subject, but we have quite a diffused flow coming out of this bottom left hand corner across here into these rocks, into the mountainside here, and then along the horizon. That is a line that can definitely be enhanced through a little bit of thoughtful processing, so we'll do that right now. What we're really looking at here is accentuating existing lines of interest. So if we use the adjustment brush with a medium amount of exposure, so just 1/4 of a stop, a reasonable amount of flow, because then you can see it going on there, and clarity is something that's great to use, and we want to use a small brush with a bit of a feather. If I just bring the adjustment brush along that ridge line, and again in here, if I start highlighting some of these areas of slightly brighter, oops, that was a slip. I'm just going to boost the exposure just a fraction more so it comes on a little bit easier for everyone to see. And then this slope here and that shoreline. The eye is a very predictable thing. It is quite predictable how the eye actually is going to look at a scene, and knowing that and manipulating that and allowing us to manipulate the viewer is a really powerful tool at our disposal, because if we fail to do this, then an awful lot of the power and interpretation of the image is lost. Now, if I turn this off and back on again, now I've been pretty heavy-handed here because I want you to be able to see the effect. It's probably a little overdone. I would dial it back a fraction, and it becomes a lot more subliminal then. So we're looking at about a quarter of a stop, a third of a stop. So if I turn it off and then on, the eye now naturally follows this bright highlight in the foreground across the water to these rocks, up onto this brighter area of slope, which then leads us down across for the eyes to rest finally on the mountains in the distance. If we turn it off, all the visual clues were there, but they were less obvious. And by making this single adjustment with the adjustment brush, we've made things quite a bit more obvious. The same applies for just about any image we do. If we go back to this image that we looked at earlier, we have natural flow lines. We have one coming out of the left-hand corner here, through here, that snakes through and comes into the mountains in the distance again. We have a lesser flow line that comes around this left-hand side to take us to the same point. And even this line here can be considered a flow line as well. So you have to look for the natural flow in the image. So if I take the adjustment brush again, and I'm going to take off the clarity, and a nice big brush with a medium amount of flow, if I paint through here, and all I'm doing here is adding a little bit of brightness to the areas where I'm brushing. So if we use the O key, you can see that it's really the water that I'm highlighting. And if I just push that exposure slightly, we now have a much more obvious flow line that takes us round those objects. We've created a visual contrast between the darker rocks and the brighter water, which has enhanced that flow quite significantly. I can even touch a little spot in there. And what it's also doing as a byproduct of that is creating 3D separation, because the flatness of two-dimensional photographs, or looking at an image on a monitor, is the two-dimensionality of it. And that shaping and making things much more 3D is a hugely important way of doing these things. So I'm going to do a second brush adjustment, and I'm going to add a little bit of warmth, a little bit of brightness, and a little bit of clarity. And I'm going to work in these areas here. And I just want to touch on these bright, it's basically the left hand side of the rocks. And what it's going to do is just give the impression that the light is coming from that left hand side a little bit stronger and a little bit warmer than it actually was. And you can see how quickly these rocks in the foreground are taking shape and becoming significantly more contoured. And it can be, it's a process that requires a little bit of time and patience. And we can even come down this, just reduce the flow a fraction. We can even come down this leading edge there too, and then tail it off, and just in there. And now, if we turn it off and back on again, you will see a huge difference in the shape and texture of those foreground rocks. And it really helps to lead the eye now, because we now have this natural flow coming through from the bottom of the frame, through this area of high contrast, across these rocks in the foreground, and then zigzagging back through into the mountains in the background, to a situation whereby we have a much deeper and much more perceivably 3D image. Something else I would probably do here is use a gradient filter and take off the effect, hold down the shift key, because I want a nice diffused gradient from the top. And I'm just going to darken that sky a little touch further and make it just a fraction colder too. It's not unusual for things to appear bluer the more far away they are. Bluing can definitely create a perceived distance and depth in our frame, and you'll see that just by feel I'm able to come into this, and all I'm doing is adjusting the temperature and the tint. The sky was quite magenta, so I'm negating that. I'm cancelling it out by making it more green, and obviously the blue has an effect on cooling things quite significantly. And then if I come back in to this one, and I'm gonna erase it from that slope because it was making it too blue. It was making it too warm, and it wasn't visually consistent with how it is. So I can create a new adjustment brush, zero the effect, add half a stop with a really low flow, and I'm just going to take a slight brightening of that leading edge, and the effect is still the same in that it shows the light coming from that left hand side a little, but I've taken the color out of it. So there we have it. We have a situation where if I go back into the library module, we can see where we started and where we've taken it, and you know that's a very profound difference, and I think it should be quite clear that we're leading the eye through the frame far more effectively in the right hand side than on the left hand side. So for now, that will do for this section, and we'll move on to some more devices in a moment. I'd like to think by now that it should be fairly clear that all we're doing is using the same tools time and time and time again. We're not doing anything that's ridiculously complicated. It's just that each image has its own needs, it has its own requirements, and we can basically look at any image, or we should be able to look at any image and say, what's the best interpretation for this? Now, we have to assume that the camera is not harvesting light exactly as we want it to appear in our final images. Cameras just don't work like that. There's nothing to say that in moody pre-dawn light or after sunset that white balance is particularly accurate. Certainly the contrast within the scene might not necessarily be that accurate. We have to basically make some assumptions that our cameras are not always right. And the purpose of these videos has been to show that by using a fairly set of standard tools in creative and interesting ways, we can produce images that are far more expressive and are far better representation of not just what we experienced at that time, but what we want to convey about that place to the viewer. I'm going to use this as a final example. It's a fairly broad scene of a Scottish glen in winter, just around sunrise, a little bit of brighter areas on the horizon, sort of indicating that that's where the light was coming from. A little bit of pinking in the clouds. And this is the white balance straight out the camera. I've had nothing has been done to this image at all. I haven't even added my import punch preset, which would obviously contrast things up particularly nicely to start off with. So I'm just going to start with a completely reset file. And the reason I use the import punch preset is really to give my images that kind of quite contrasty, quite punchy look that I like to start my images with. But I'm going to start this one completely from scratch just to show how flexible interpretations can be. So something we've already said as a good starting point is determining the overall mood and feel. And the point of this is to determine whether we want it to be generally a warm image with cooler shadows, or whether we want to have a generally cool image with some brighter highlights. And let's say we want the scene to dictate the experience. It was cold, it was a winter morning in January on the Isle of Skye. So let's start with something a little colder. It was before sunrise, so let's start with something a little darker. So already we've made two adjustments, one to the temperature and one to the exposure, and we have already made a significant shift towards a cooler, moodier image. This area of warmth, I think, is quite a nice little touch, and I think if we connect that in some way to this brighter area on the horizon, we can kind of add a slightly optimistic feel to it. This leading line is clearly very important, as is this mountain here. So we need to look for our flow. We have this line going through the frame, we have our peak, and then we have another line taking us back over to these mountains, and it might be nice to finish with a nice pinky glow in the distance, just to let us know that there's some hope on the horizon on this cold day. So I'm not going to make too many global adjustments, because the primary ones I wanted to deal with are in the overall temperature and the overall exposure. I am going to make a couple of straightforward standard adjustments of enabling profile corrections and removing chromatic aberration. There might be a bit of chromatic aberration in there on that horizon. And as is a fairly standard part of my processing, I'm just going to use the camera calibration to just punch up some of those colors. And you can start to see there's a little bit of richness in some of these highlights. There's a touch of pink, there's a nice touch of pink there, and I want to use these areas to just bring little hints of warmer light. There's a tiny touch there on the horizon as well. So let's listen to the image, let it dictate what we want to do. So I'm happy with the sky at the moment in terms of its tonality. I'm happy with the general exposure that's running through the frame. Let us start by just accentuating that leading line. And I have a very low flow, and I can adjust the exposure amount for now, and we want to make sure there's no color going to be added to this. So I'm just going to paint in gently with a neutral brush. So in other words, I'm not going to add color to this adjustment. But what I am doing is just accentuating the existing lines of flow through this image. Some of that is a leading line, and some of it is just other little highlights. And because the brush is set fairly low, this effect is going on pretty gentle. If I increase the exposure, then obviously that brings the effect through into a much more pronounced, which is going to be easier for you to see on this video. I want to brighten this mountain and this one. Now, something I didn't mention earlier on when I was covering the tools was this auto mask facility. If I have auto mask deselected, and let me turn up the flow, and with this brush, I'm going to take off the feather. I'm just going to roll this brush over that edge, and if I press the O key, you'll see that it's gone right over the edge there, which means that if I want to make any adjustment to this mountain, it's going to be hopeless. If I hit the auto mask button and give it a slight feather and make the brush a little smaller, I should hopefully be able to demonstrate that the brush can be a little bit more focused. Now, this edge is not really pronounced enough to show it well, but normally if you have a very pronounced edge, such as like here is better, you know, where you've got a much more pronounced edge. Here it's going to bleed onto the sky, so you need to go in with your eraser and shave that off, because what I'm wanting to do is just brighten that snow a fraction, and that has allowed the end point of that line to be quite pronounced. That's probably a little over. Just a touch, just, 20% of 30%, 30% of a stop. And what that's done is it's just made it just a tiny bit brighter in that far corner, and it just gives the eye somewhere to go. And I'm going to do the same on some of the peaks over here, but with a very slight flow. I don't really want to over exaggerate the brightness in that peak there, but let's just make it a little bit brighter. And there we have it. That's for a first start in terms of our whites, and the leading line coming through here. This peak is obviously very significant. Then across here to this. Brighter objects are going to attract the eye a lot more than dark objects. I mean, these dark shadows, they shape the landscape, but they're not really drawing the eye particularly. What we do want to do is bring out some of the highlights. So these areas on the water, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to use a warmer brush. And again, we do want to brighten them slightly because we're wanting to create visual contrast. This is what this final case study is all about. We need to create contrasts. And whether that is from areas of cool to warm or bright to dark or high detail to low detail, it doesn't matter. We need to bring in contrasts. And I'll show you later that even by reducing contrast, we can increase contrast. So I'm just going to paint ever so gently in there and there. And I think it's clear that the adjustments that we're making, I don't think anybody would say that they're unreasonable. It's really just a case of enhancing what is already there. I wouldn't go to the stage with this image of saying that we're particularly faking anything or pushing things too far. Everyone has their own line in the sand. Every time I've had this conversation when I've been teaching this type of creative processing, everyone has their own line in the sand where they are prepared to stop. Some people will work images, I mean, I'm not going to say to death, but they're certainly going to work them way past the point that I would. I don't believe in adding things that aren't there. I certainly wouldn't add a moon, or I don't even particularly like cloning that much. I wouldn't take things out necessarily. It's like I wouldn't take a rock out or things like that. But what we've done here with some pretty subtle little touches is just bring out some of these little warmer highlights, and by adding that little warm highlight in there, we've now produced something that I would like to think is visually, quite appealing. This side's obviously kind of nice too, but this is the point, is that images can go any way you want. If we go back to this one here and say, well, let's warm the whole image up a fraction. Globally, all of those changes still work because these areas are still warmer than these areas. This is still warmer than the surrounding mountains. Doesn't matter how cold you go, those areas are still going to be warmer. Obviously, you reach a point where you end up with something like this. But we still have visual contrast because we still have warm to cool, bright to dark. high contrast to low contrast. So there's no, the image can dictate. So I'm just going to stick with this one now. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm just basically going to say, right, let's draw with zero effect on this gradient tool. Let's drag down a nice diffused header, a nice diffused top. And let's say we're going to cool that background a bit. So bring down the temperature until things start to get noticeably cooler. And then I'm going to reduce contrast, which means we can darken it even more. And then I'm going to remove clarity. And clarity is basically a detail slider. It's local sharpening in micro contrast. So if I reduce the clarity, the whole background gets quite misty and diffused. So now I have a cool, low contrast, misty background, which contrasts now massively with this beautifully rich and textured foreground. And if I wanted to bring in another gradient tool and slide up here, I could get away with cooling this slightly. People always get on about reflections. This isn't a pure reflection. This here is not reflecting this. This here is reflecting stuff that's way up off the top of the frame. So you're not actually seeing a lot of the stuff that this is reflecting. So you can have a totally different colored sky above you, reflecting down on water that's producing something that looks nothing like the immediate horizon, especially if the horizon line is very high in the frame. Now, the point I really want to keep on making with creative processing is saying, look at the image, let it speak to you. Is it going to be cool? Is it going to be warm? Is it going to be high contrast? Is it going to be low contrast? Is it going to be highly textured, low detail? The choices are yours. I cannot tell you how to process your images. I can only show you what I would do in certain situations. If I want to add a vignette to this, and really that's inverted, so that's by adding a slight vignette, we're now in a situation where we hold the eye in the center of the frame, significantly more so than we did before. The image changes all the time. Every time I make an adjustment, we have a different image. Every time we make an adjustment, we're giving a different statement to the viewer. So what am I wanting to say here? I'm wanting to say to the viewer, this is what this place looks like. If you were to stand in this place, this is the arrangement of the geography. You have Marsco on the left, you have Sgurnan on the right, you're looking up Glen Sligachen. This is the river at a certain height at a certain time of the year. This is what it looked like in terms of the arrangement of the elements. But I then want to take it a step further and say, where is the viewer's eye going to go? And I know that it's going to come snaking up this white line to this peak, go across the horizon, and it's going to finish up in this sort of exploring the distance. And something I like to do an awful lot with images is to leave areas that are quite dark, because it creates mystery, it creates areas of shadow that people can peer into, and it demands a certain amount of discovery. I then like to accentuate highlights. So I like to make that contrast between cool areas and warm areas. We have areas with no texture and no detail, through to areas down here on the right hand side that are full of rich textures and detail. So I might want to add a new adjustment brush. This is something you will notice straight away with the way I process images, is that an image is never finished. It's never ever finished. You just reach a stage where you're prepared to walk away from it. Because what I've done here is I've added a little bright highlight to that edge, and with a bit of clarity. And what that's done is it's just accentuated the textures on there. And again, I could take another brush and just paint in the top of that rock, because it's quite rich and red. And at the moment I've just brightened it. I can add saturation, I can add a bit more warmth and add a bit of clarity. So let's just cover a couple of these sliders again, because whether you're using the gradial, the graduated filter, the radial filter, or the adjustment brush, we're using the same set of parameters. Temperature and tint, cool to warm, green to magenta. That's the way to control the temperature of the light in various areas, warming it up, cooling it down. The exposure slider is tackling the midtones, so if you want to brighten somewhere or darken somewhere, this is a slider we use. Contrast is self-explanatory. Highlights, by definition, zones in on the highlights. If I want to paint in here to try and control those highlights a little, zero the effect, kill the highlights completely, hit the brush with a fairly high flow, and paint across there, and we've killed the highlights. If you boost them up the other way, kill them down a bit, it can make them just a little bit more controlled. Sometimes you want a big bright area in the frame, other times you want to retain some texture in your highlights, so that's the way you do it. Shadows opens up some of these areas. Let's open up just that little fraction of hillside there. So I'm going to knock off all the effect, and all I'm going to do is add a little bit of light, open up the shadows, and I want to add warmth to them as well, because you can see there is a slight natural warmth to there. And I'm just going to run the mouse once or twice across that slope, and if you feel you've gone too far, all you do is dial back the exposure or dial back the shadow slider. And in this case, it was the exposure slider was making the most impact and the shadows was making less of an impact. But again, tiny, subtle, little difference. But by opening up those shadows, we've just allowed that depth to continue. River, hillside, distant mountains. And that has got a little bit opened up there. So I'm just going to darken that and cool that. Again, don't forget that the darker something is, the less the eye gets drawn to it. So I'm just going to darken that peak quite a bit to just create that illusion of a bit more depth, and I'm just going to cool it down a wee bit more. Like I said, images are never finished. They just reach a stage where you're prepared to walk away from them. I could sit and look at this image and I could talk to you for another 2 hours, and every time I talk to you I can bring in something else, because I could just go like this and say, okay, this rock, I just want to brighten that and add clarity, and I want to make it warmer, and there we go. And suddenly we have something that's way more significant than it was before. We now have something that before was almost visually invisible, and now it becomes a significant part of the frame. There is no end to processing. There's no end to creative processing. And really, what I hope that you can take away from this video is the understanding that the tools are straightforward. You're only making simple adjustments, adding contrast, reducing contrast, changing color, making things darker, making them brighter. We're talking about very simple adjustments with 2 or 3 different tools, but the trick and the power is being able to look at your image and make that decision. What does this need? What can I do with this image? And I hope this video has been inspiring for you, and I hope that you take a lot out of it. And well, thanks very much for watching. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Cheers now. Bye.